I still remember the sound of his voice, the careless pitch that sliced through the air the moment he said, "She's just a cleaner," as though those 4 words encapsulated everything he believed me to be. That offhand remark set off an ache beneath my ribs, one that pulsed and spread, reminding me how easily the people you love can reduce you to the smallest, flimsiest image of yourself. I was standing in the kitchen with a dish rag in my hand, half listening to him talk to his new girlfriend in the adjoining living room. When I heard him say those words, a strange hush seemed to settle, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if I would respond. But I only stood there, hand frozen around that damp cloth, feeling my heart sink with a sense of betrayal so deep I almost couldn't breathe. My own child, grown now, humiliating me with such casual cruelty. I used to cradle him in my arms when he was just a pink-faced infant, and as he slept, I'd imagine the strong, caring young man he might become one day. But hearing him in that moment, the flash of superiority in his tone, made me feel as though all those tender hopes had been rinsed away like the soap bubbles I used to wash his little onesies. I never thought I'd see the day he would speak of me as if I were the dirt under the rug, unseen and unimportant. I pressed my lips together, swallowing the sour taste in my mouth, and I tried to tamp down the anger rising in my chest. At first, I told myself there must be an explanation. Perhaps he was trying to impress the girl, showing her he wasn't weighed down by old familial attachments. Or maybe he was in a bitter mood, lashing out for reasons he didn't care to share. But deep inside, I recognized the truth. He'd grown to see me as nothing more than the role I fulfilled around the house. In his eyes, I was the woman who scrubbed the floors, laundered the sheets, and tidied the clutter. I was service staff in a building that happened to be my own home, someone invisible unless she wasn't doing her job well enough. That realization hit me with a gut-wrenching clarity that made me grip the edge of the kitchen counter for support. My vision blurred briefly, tears threatening to break through. I reminded myself to breathe, tried to keep my composure, but a single tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. He didn't see that tear. He didn't see me at all. He was too busy continuing his story, painting a portrait of himself as a self-made young professional, bragging about some promotion he'd received. If I'd wanted, I could have interjected with a few truths, like how I'd put in extra hours cleaning offices late at night to pay for part of his tuition, or how I'd swallow my pride while bending over more toilets than I cared to count, so that he could have decent shoes and a new backpack each year. But I kept silent. I didn't want his girlfriend to see my embarrassment, or to see him dismiss it with a roll of his eyes. Instead, I quietly set aside the dish rag, took a deep breath, and moved to the hallway to hang it on the drying rack. I needed a moment alone, away from that stifling sense of betrayal that seemed to press in on me from every angle. My heart pounded against my chest, but I forced myself to walk slowly, determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing my hurt, especially if he wasn't even aware of how cutting his words had been. That evening, I went to bed early, but sleep did not come easily. I lay under the covers in my small bedroom, staring at the ceiling, remembering how different things used to be. When he was younger, he'd rush through the front door after school, his backpack dangling from one shoulder, and he'd call out, "Mom," in a tone that echoed relief and delight. Then he'd plop down at the kitchen table, devouring the sandwiches I made. The memories felt more like daydreams now, ghostly images that had no place in the present. I tried to tell myself that all kids drift away, that perhaps this was normal. But the way he spoke about me, like I was beneath him, suggested something else, something meaner. It stung because I never expected that kind of meanness from him. He'd been raised to be better than that, or so I thought. I mulled over the moment he'd called me just a cleaner, trying to pinpoint the moment he'd started seeing me as small. Was it after he moved out? After he started dating that flashy new girlfriend who told him about networking and social circles and online image building? Maybe she'd awakened the snobbish streak I'd hoped he'd never develop. Or perhaps his father's side of the family, so often critical of my background and my lowly job, had finally gotten through to him. His father and I had split years ago, not on friendly terms, and part of me wondered if the seeds of contempt had been planted back then, in the heated arguments that erupted when our finances grew tight and the only job I could land was housekeeping. Regardless of how it happened, I felt the distance between us now like a canyon, and I had no idea how to cross it. Every time I closed my eyes that night, I pictured his face, the slight smirk that curled his lip when he said those words. I also thought about his ex-girlfriend, another relationship that I'd always found somewhat puzzling but had once believed was good for him. She was young, ambitious, a sharp mind for public relations of all things. When they split, it was abrupt, and I never quite got the full story. I just remembered the ex showing up at my doorstep one day, handing me a little tin of tea as a thank you gift for the kindness I showed her. Her eyes were filled with sadness, and I hadn't pried, assuming it was none of my business. But I had always liked her. She treated me with a gentle respect that was rare among his friends. Over time, I'd almost forgotten about her in the swirl of daily routines, but now, as I lay there feeling worthless, my mind drifted to her. She was a professional cleaner, not of houses but of reputations. A public relations strategist who specialized in damage control. The irony of her line of work flickered in my mind. I wondered what she was doing now, where her career had taken her, and whether she even recalled the day she brought me that small tin of tea. The next morning, I awoke early with swollen eyes and a raw feeling in my chest that wouldn't dissipate. I made coffee, sipped it in the cold quiet of dawn, and mulled over everything I felt. The mixture of shame and anger left me restless. My house was eerily silent. My son had already left for work. I couldn't help but wish he'd linger in the mornings the way he used to, but I also dreaded facing his careless attitude. Maybe it was best he was gone. With trembling hands, I opened my laptop. I had a compulsion to do something about the venomous remark he'd cast so casually. I typed in the ex's name, half expecting to find nothing. But there she was, all polished and professional, her smiling photo on a website for a PR firm. A quick read told me she'd made strides in her career, focusing on high-profile clients who needed image makeovers after personal or corporate scandals. They called her the Deep Cleaner, a nickname that made me smile wryly. As I read on, an idea took root in my mind, an idea that felt almost too audacious to consider. Yet the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to bloom, unstoppable, in the pit of my stomach. I wanted my son to see what it truly meant to clean, to salvage, to restore, to be indispensable. And who better to demonstrate that than the woman who once loved him, someone who understood both his strengths and his pitfalls. I knew it might sound absurd, but I also felt an odd sense of righteousness brewing within me. If he was so bent on superficial appearances and polished facades, maybe it was time he felt the sting of professional consequences. His current girlfriend was all about that social ladder, climbing it, flaunting it, keeping up the perfect online presence. He was adopting her ways, painting this grand portrait of success, but it was all so thin. Beneath it, he was still the kid I remembered, the one who sometimes cried out for guidance. Perhaps, I rationalized, a lesson, no, a demonstration, would open his eyes. He thought my skills were limited to scrubbing floors, but there was so much more to me than that. If I could align with his ex, show him how a real cleaner operates, maybe he'd realize the value he so blithely dismissed. I was shaking when I first dialed her number. The phone rang, and I half expected no answer. But then a soft click and a voice. Hello? My mind raced, imagining her confusion at hearing me on the line. She must have had plenty of clients with bigger names, more dire public scandals. Yet I introduced myself carefully, reminding her who I was. There was a moment of silence and then an exhaled breath of recognition. She remembered me. I felt a surge of relief I couldn't quite explain. My heart pounded, and I heard the tremor in my voice as I explained, in halting terms, that I needed a meeting. I didn't say it was about my son. Not yet. I simply said I had a personal matter that required her brand of expertise. To my surprise, she agreed. We set a date for coffee at a discreet cafe downtown. After I hung up, I leaned against the wall, feeling both exhilarated and terrified by what I'd set in motion. Part of me wanted to back out immediately, but another part, an angry, hurt part, insisted I see this through. On the day of our meeting, the sky was gray, promising rain. I arrived early, nerves jangling. I picked a corner table away from the windows, unsure if I wanted to be seen discussing anything that might lead to questions. My mind replayed my son's callous words over and over, fueling a mix of determination and trembling uncertainty. Then she walked in. She looked more polished than before, her hair smoothed into a chic style, her blazer pressed to perfection. There was a subtle confidence in her gait, and when she spotted me, she smiled politely. I rose to greet her, noticing the faint hesitation in her eyes, as though she wasn't quite sure how personal this encounter might get. We ordered coffee, and for the first few minutes, we exchanged stilted small talk. I felt grateful that she took the time to ask how I was, how life had been, and she admitted she was surprised to hear from me. Her voice was warmer than I expected, free of the typical PR coldness one might assume from her profession. Then, carefully, I broached the subject. I explained the dynamic that had taken hold between me and my son, though I omitted the specifics of that infamous, "just a cleaner" remark. I told her he was in a new relationship, that he'd become obsessed with outward impressions and social standing, and that I feared he was on a path to losing himself. She listened quietly, her brow furrowed with concern or maybe curiosity. I could see the swirl of questions in her eyes, but she let me finish. After I poured out my heart, I told her I wanted her help. I wanted to hire her, not for the usual kind of PR project. No, this was more personal. I wanted her to orchestrate a situation where my son would come face to face with the consequences of his shallow judgments, where he'd be forced to see me, and himself, in a different light. It wasn't about destroying him or humiliating him publicly. It was about cracking that facade so he could realize he wasn't above the people who'd always been there for him. She stared at me for a moment, seemingly taken aback. "You want me to stage something?" she asked, her voice low. I nodded, my cheeks warming with self-consciousness. A small part of me worried she'd see me as vindictive or vengeful, but I clung to the hope that she'd understand. Her gaze flickered across my face, and I thought I saw a flicker of empathy. She took a sip of coffee, exhaled, and finally said she'd need time to think about it. She had her professional ethics to consider, and she also wondered how it might complicate her personal history with my son. But she didn't dismiss me outright. Instead, she asked me to write down every detail, what specifically he'd done, how his behavior had changed, and what my ultimate goal was. "If I do this," she added, "it needs to be precise. It can't be a half-baked plan." I agreed, relief washing over me. In that moment, I felt a small vindication. I was more than just a cleaner. I was a mother who would fight for her son's soul, even if that meant employing unorthodox means. We parted ways with a tentative agreement to keep in touch. That night, I wrote her a long email, outlining all the changes I'd observed in him since he took up with his new girlfriend. I detailed how he'd gradually stopped visiting for family dinners, how he talked incessantly about brand names and networking events, how he'd cut ties with old friends he deemed insufficiently prestigious. I explained my heartbreak in seeing him drift so far from the caring young man he once was. Finally, I told her about the remark, how he'd labeled me, "just a cleaner." I left nothing out, concluding with a plea for her help in teaching him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget, but one that might guide him back to empathy and understanding. With trembling fingers, I clicked send and felt a wave of apprehension. Was I crossing a line? Days passed. I kept cleaning, though my routine felt heavier, as though every sweep of the broom carried my sorrow and frustration with it. My son remained as distant as ever, offering barely a curt nod in my direction when we crossed paths. Then I received an email from her. She wrote that she believed in second chances. She felt it for him, though they'd parted ways, and she remembered enough of his good qualities that she wanted to see if this might shake him awake. She proposed a plan, a carefully orchestrated PR fiasco that would revolve around him, but in such a way that it wouldn't irreparably damage his career. Rather, it would highlight the flaws in his current worldview. She wrote, "Sometimes people need a reflection of their own hypocrisy to see how far they've fallen." My heart raced as I read her words, both fearful and exhilarated. I replied immediately, asking to meet in person again. That second meeting was more intense. We sat in a private booth at a small restaurant, going over the details in hushed voices. She sketched out the scenario. She would approach him under the guise of a new professional contract, offering her services to boost his online presence and refine his public image. But in the process, she'd stage events or reveal truths that would force him to confront the very dynamics he was perpetuating. The brilliance of her plan was in how subtle it was. It wouldn't be obvious that he was being taught a lesson. It would just look like a reputational revamp, which, in his current state, he'd likely jump at. Meanwhile, she'd make sure the narrative behind the scenes pointed to his hypocrisy and ingratitude. At first, he might not connect the dots, but eventually, piece by piece, he'd realize that the foundation of his cultivated image was built on the same disregard and arrogance he'd shown me. By the time he recognized the lesson, it would be too late to deny or ignore it. And that was precisely the point. Sitting there, listening to her speak with such passion, I recalled the times she used to have dinner with us. She would stay late, helping me clean up, asking about my day, complimenting my cooking. I saw a gleam in her eyes now, reminiscent of the warmth she once had for him. She asked if I was truly ready for what this might do to our relationship. I paused, the question reverberating in my mind. Was I? The small flicker of doubt arose, but then I remembered the bruising weight of his words. I remembered all the sacrifices I'd made, the nights spent working double shifts, the birthdays I spent scrubbing floors because that was the only way to put food on our table. If he refused to see my worth, maybe he needed an unequivocal demonstration that cleaning is never just cleaning, whether it's a tiled floor or a tarnished reputation. I swallowed hard and nodded. "I'm ready," I whispered, hoping I was telling the truth. In the days that followed, I watched from the sidelines as the plan started to take shape. She reached out to him, explaining that her firm had a potential client interested in collaborating with someone in his field. She pitched it as a visibility project, a chance for him to polish his image and get his name out there among key influencers and industry leaders. I saw the spark of interest in his eyes when she came by the house, though he tried to act casual about it. She introduced herself in a purely professional manner, almost as though they hadn't shared a relationship. He looked a bit uneasy. Maybe the memories lingered, but the allure of a bigger public profile was obviously stronger. He listened intently, nodding at all the right moments. She spoke with an air of self-assuredness, referencing marketing strategies and brand-building tactics. He was hooked. I stood at a distance, dusting a bookshelf, but in truth, I was eavesdropping on every word. There was a certain pang in my chest, watching them interact as strangers with a shared history. But I also felt a strange sense of pride in her. She was brilliant, weaving a web of facts and half-truths that would lead him exactly where we wanted him to go. A few days later, my son came to me, his voice filled with forced nonchalance. He said he'd bumped into his ex, strange coincidence, and they were talking about a possible business collaboration. He didn't mention her name, just referred to her as a PR consultant who had big ideas on how to propel him forward. I asked if he was okay working with her, given their past. He shrugged, a sly grin tugging at his lips. If it helps me get ahead, why not? His casual tone made something inside me tighten. It was clear that his ambition trumped any emotional history or potential awkwardness. I nodded and didn't probe further, content to let him believe I was oblivious. Meanwhile, I knew she was already setting the stage, ensuring that every angle of this arrangement was primed to make him see what it really meant to clean up a mess. The first phase of her plan was subtle. She invited him to attend a networking event, telling him it would be the perfect opportunity to mingle with influential people in his industry. Unbeknownst to him, she'd arranged for a few carefully planted individuals to drop hints about the importance of gratitude and authenticity in one's personal brand. This took the form of small talk about how phony images crumble under scrutiny and how people who climb the ladder by stepping on others often find themselves alone at the top. My son, clueless about the manipulation, laughed and nodded, acting as if he already lived by those principles. I watched from afar. I wore a simple outfit, helping the event coordinator with tidying up and serving drinks, blending into the background. It seemed fitting. I was the invisible help, exactly where he believed I belonged. As the night progressed, I caught him tossing me a cursory glance, but he never approached me to talk or introduce me to anyone. I kept my emotions in check, reminding myself that the real confrontation was yet to come. Behind the scenes, I heard from her that the next phase would involve a manufactured crisis. She explained to him that to raise his profile, they might want to stage something that would draw media attention, an accidental leak of a rumor, perhaps. My son, seduced by the idea of an overnight popularity boost, agreed. He had no idea that the rumor would revolve around his apparent disrespect for his own mother, nor that it would paint him in an unflattering light. She planted it in a minor gossip column, a snippet claiming he'd referred to a close family member as beneath him. It was vague enough that he wouldn't immediately know it was about me, but pointed enough that speculation would swirl. When he saw it online, he was both outraged and intrigued. Outraged because it threatened his pristine facade. Intrigued because negative press could sometimes be turned into a golden opportunity, so he believed. He asked her to handle it, to spin it in a way that made him look sympathetic and misunderstood. And that was where the lesson would begin to tighten its grip. She started by telling him they needed to show that he was actually devoted to uplifting those around him, especially those in traditional service roles. She suggested a public philanthropic gesture, something that would create a heartwarming story, perhaps volunteering at a local community center or donating to a foundation that helped underpaid cleaning staff in corporate buildings. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was basically forced to support people in my line of work, all to prove that he wasn't the pompous jerk that rumor made him out to be. His new girlfriend seemed all for it, probably because it made for great social media content. The plan was set. I watched him pack a box of old clothes, things he'd never wear again, brand name items that no longer fit his image, and load them into his car. She'd arranged a photo op at the community center, where a few cameras would be waiting to capture his giving spirit. The center, bless them, was just happy for any donations, no matter the motive. I arrived at the community center separately, volunteering to help set up the donation drive. My heart pounded when I saw him step out of his car, the new girlfriend perched at his side. There was a hint of disdain in her expression as she glanced around, probably unimpressed by the humble surroundings. He forced a bright, camera-ready smile. When a reporter interviewed him about why he chose this cause, he rattled off some canned response about wanting to honor the hardworking men and women who keep our communities clean and safe. For a moment, I wondered if he felt any twinge of discomfort, remembering his dismissive words about me. If he did, it didn't show. He was too busy relishing the camera flashes. Later, I found myself in the kitchen area, preparing refreshments for the volunteers. He walked in, probably in search of water, and froze when he saw me there. It was the first time we'd been alone in weeks. "Hey," he said. I nodded. I waited, curious if he'd bring up the rumor or show any hint of remorse. "You, volunteer here often?" he asked, sounding awkward. I told him I helped out when I could, a gentle reminder that there was more to my life than scrubbing floors. He cleared his throat, then muttered something about how the event was going well. Then, just as quickly, he turned on his heel and left. I felt a flicker of pain. Even with a rumor swirling about his disrespect toward family, he couldn't bring himself to address it directly with me. When the photo op concluded, he left, presumably to attend some after-party with a more glamorous crowd. I stayed behind to sweep up confetti and stack chairs. As I worked, I noticed one of the cameras left behind, the lens pointed at the door. My reflection in the lens made me pause. I looked tired, a little older than I remembered. But there was a resoluteness in my eyes that steadied me. The thought of how this plan might play out filled me with a charged sense of anticipation. I reminded myself that this wasn't purely revenge. I wanted him to see me, to respect me as more than a convenient background figure in his life. If it took orchestrating a PR fiasco to do that, so be it. Yet somewhere in my heart, I hoped we might find a moment of honest connection once all the layers of artifice were stripped away. The next few days brought a swirl of online chatter. The rumor about him calling someone in his family beneath him snowballed. People speculated who it might be, why he'd say it. Some netizens called him arrogant, while others rushed to his defense, pointing out his recent philanthropic act. Meanwhile, he scrambled behind the scenes, directing all inquiries to his ex, who calmly assured the media that the real story would come out soon. She crafted carefully worded statements about how my son valued his family and had always been generous with his time and resources. The new girlfriend posted a few curated photos on social media, painting them as a caring couple involved in community service. But the seed of doubt had been planted. His brand, or so he liked to call it, now had a smudge, and people were curious. It was a small scandal, but enough to keep tongues wagging. At home, he seemed tense, hunched over his laptop each evening, reading comments and articles about himself. I passed by his room once and saw the lines of worry on his forehead. Part of me felt sorry for him, but another part, perhaps the part still stinging from his contempt, felt a grim satisfaction. He wanted to be a figure of admiration, but now he was confronted with the possibility that his public persona could unravel. He retreated into phone calls and whispered conversations, sometimes with his ex, sometimes with his new girlfriend. They argued occasionally about how best to handle the rumor. The new girlfriend demanded a grand public statement. The ex insisted that a slow, subtle approach would be more effective. I lingered nearby, occasionally dusting or vacuuming, hearing snatches of these debates. He never once considered that I might be within earshot, or that my heart was pounding at the mention of this family member he had supposedly belittled. He just wanted the crisis gone, as if it were a stain he could blot out with the right brand of cleaner. Slowly, the ex orchestrated the next stage, a carefully scheduled interview with a local talk show. She convinced him that telling his side of the story would help rehabilitate his image. He agreed. The plan was that he would speak earnestly about his background, about how he was raised by a hardworking single mother, all to show that the rumor couldn't be true. This was the moment she'd been building toward, forcing him to talk about me publicly, to praise my sacrifices, and to align himself with my values he'd been mocking in private. The day of the interview arrived, and I made sure I was present, though he didn't know I'd be in the audience. The set was modest, just a few chairs and a backdrop, bright lights, and cameras rolling. He sat under those lights, wearing a carefully chosen outfit that struck the right balance between professional and approachable. His new girlfriend was off to the side, face pinched with anxiety. The ex was there too, phone in hand, likely sending instructions to the show's producer. The host, a congenial middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor, introduced him. The conversation started lightly, with questions about his career, his aspirations, his philanthropic endeavors. He answered smoothly, confident in his ability to charm. Then came the pivot. The host mentioned the rumor, tiptoeing around specifics, but hinting that there was talk of him belittling someone close to him. My son stiffened slightly, but he pressed on with the script. He talked about how important his mother was to him, how she taught him the value of hard work, how he'd always admired her resilience. I watched from the corner of the studio, arms folded, heart pounding. The dissonance between his words and the memory of him calling me just a cleaner made my chest tighten. He spun a tale of deep respect and love, each sentence sounding practiced. I almost wanted to shout, "Tell the truth." But I stayed silent. This was part of the plan. He needed to say these things, to confront his hypocrisy in a very public way. Then came the curveball. The host smiled warmly and said, "That's wonderful to hear. You must be very proud of her. She's here with us today." My breath caught. This was the ex's doing, her final reveal. My son looked blindsided, glancing around the set. Sure enough, the camera panned over to me. I stepped forward, feeling the bright lights on my face, momentarily blinded by the glare. My heart thundered, and for a moment I was sure my voice would fail me. But I managed to stand there, chin held high. The audience clapped politely, but I sensed the tension in the air. My son tried to maintain a polite smile, but I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. This wasn't part of his comfortable script. The host began asking me questions about my work ethic, about how I'd raised him alone, praising me for my dedication. I answered in halting words at first, describing how I started cleaning offices and houses, how I'd do anything to ensure he had what he needed. I felt the weight of years in every syllable. The audience nodded sympathetically. Then the host turned to my son again, asking if there was anything he wanted to say to me directly, now that he had the chance to thank me publicly. He hesitated, and for a split second, I saw the young boy he used to be, uncertain and vulnerable. He opened his mouth, and I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd finally apologize or show real gratitude. Instead, he trotted out more platitudes, praising me for my sacrifices and resilience, calling me an inspiration. On the surface, it sounded wonderful, but I caught a tremor in his voice, like he was choking on the words because he knew, deep down, how hollow they were. He reached out and took my hand. I forced a small smile, praying that I'd find some sincerity in his eyes. But all I saw was fear of being exposed, fear of losing his carefully constructed image. My gut twisted, and I felt the burn of tears. I forced them back, determined not to cry on camera. The host, satisfied with the emotional moment, gestured for a round of applause. That was my cue to exit the stage while the interview wrapped up. As I walked away, I felt an odd mixture of triumph and sorrow. He'd said the words, put on the show, but I sensed that the real epiphany hadn't dawned on him yet. He was just following the PR playbook his ex had laid out. I wondered if he'd ever truly grasped the depth of what he'd done to me, or if this was merely another performance. After the show, everything seemed calm on the surface. My son avoided discussing the interview with me. He retreated into calls with his ex, presumably strategizing the next move. Online, the rumor shifted in tone. Now people were praising him for clearing the air, for lovingly recognizing his mother's sacrifices. But a smaller subset of netizens continued to question the sincerity. They dug up old posts of his, analyzing lines that hinted at arrogance. The tension grew, as though the narrative could topple any moment. Then a new piece of information leaked. An anonymous source claiming to be from his inner circle alleged that he indeed looked down on his mother's work, that he often complained about having a parent in such a menial job. My son flew into a panic, accusing old friends of betrayal, rummaging through his memories to find the possible culprit. He had no clue that the leak was orchestrated. The ex had carefully planted those lines, ensuring they would trace back to no one in particular. It was the final step in forcing him to confront the truth. And now, the walls were closing in. He asked her to set up another event, another philanthropic gesture, hoping to drown out the negative press with a bigger, more impressive demonstration of his goodwill. She obliged, but with a twist. She suggested a major fundraiser for underprivileged single mothers who worked multiple jobs to support their families. It was a natural extension of the narrative he'd put out about respecting his mom. She reasoned that supporting women in a similar position would quell the ongoing rumors. My son grasped at the idea with desperation, planning a flashy dinner banquet at a local hotel. Tickets would be sold to influential figures, proceeds going to a charity that helped single mothers in the hospitality and cleaning industries. Naturally, he insisted I be there as a guest of honor, a living testament to his newfound appreciation. I realized then how cunning the ex's plan was. He'd be forced to celebrate me in front of a crowd, to highlight my work as noble rather than shameful. The entire event would be dedicated to women who'd lived my story, and he couldn't distance himself from it without looking heartless. That night of the banquet arrived, filled with the clink of champagne glasses and the murmur of well-dressed attendees. My son and his new girlfriend mingled among them, wearing carefully rehearsed smiles. The ex was there, too, orchestrating behind the scenes. I felt out of place in my modest dress, but many of the other guests were from the same background as me, folks who had worked tough jobs and were now recognized for their resilience. I chatted with some of them, feeling a warm camaraderie that reminded me I wasn't alone in my struggles. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of my son, scanning the room with anxious eyes, as if waiting for some crisis to erupt. But for the moment, Everything proceeded smoothly. The charity representatives thanked him profusely. The attendees were charmed by the premise, a young professional giving back to the community that nurtured him. Cameras flashed. The new girlfriend struck poses, making sure to capture every angle. My son kept glancing at me, a tight smile on his lips. I smiled back, but a small voice in my mind whispered that this was all a gilded stage, a performance crafted with stealth and cunning. Then came the highlight of the evening, the presentation of an award to me, a symbolic gesture representing all the single mothers who sacrificed to help their children succeed. My son walked onto the small stage, took the microphone, and began to speak. He introduced me, recounting my years of tireless work, emphasizing how much he owed me. There was a trembling sincerity in his voice this time, perhaps born of sheer pressure. I walked up to the stage, blinking under the harsh spotlight, feeling the weight of the moment bear down on me. He handed me a small plaque and stepped aside for me to say a few words. I looked out at the gathered faces, at people snapping photos, at my son's eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. And for the first time, I felt the full power of the role I'd played in his life. I cleared my throat, my heart hammering. I spoke of the job itself, how cleaning had taught me patience, resilience, and a certain pride in meticulous care. I told them that cleaning was never just cleaning, it was about restoring a sense of dignity to the places we live and work, about ensuring a healthy, welcoming environment. Then, my gaze traveled to my son, who stood there, holding his breath. I never want my son, or anyone, to feel shame for honest work, I said, my voice breaking slightly. Work is what we make of it, and no one stands too high above others to treat them with respect. A hush fell. I heard a few sniffles in the crowd. My eyes stung with tears, but I willed myself not to cry. I looked at my son, letting those words settle on him. The moment stretched, heavy and charged. Suddenly, the hush was shattered by a phone ringing, a piercing sound in the quiet hall. Everyone turned to look. It was my son's phone, which he'd forgotten to silence. Flustered, he pulled it out, and I watched him read the screen. His face paled. I didn't know what the message said, but from the corner of my eye, I saw his ex near the back of the room, lowering her phone with a resigned expression. He stammered an apology and stepped off to the side, presumably to answer the call or read more of the text. The crowd was left in an awkward pause, uncertain how to proceed. The host, sensing the disruption, stepped in to thank me and usher me back to my seat. My legs trembled as I walked down the steps, plaque in hand. Within minutes, my son disappeared from the banquet. The new girlfriend followed, concern etched on her features. Whispers rose among the guests. I tried to maintain composure, greeting a few well-wishers, but my mind was racing. Had the plan gone off the rails? Or was this another carefully timed piece of the puzzle? Unable to wait any longer, I slipped away from the main area and found a deserted corridor. That was where I saw him, pacing back and forth, phone pressed to his ear, voice raised in a panicked tone. The new girlfriend stood nearby, trying to calm him. I caught snippets of his words, exposed me. I can't believe this, and this is going to ruin me. My stomach clenched. Something major had just broken. As I approached, he noticed me, his eyes wild with desperation. He ended the call abruptly. "Mom," he said, sounding almost like a child again. "There's some new article out. It's quoting people I went to high school with. They're saying I used to complain about you cleaning my friends' houses for extra money." His voice cracked on the last words. I felt as though a hand had gripped my throat. Memories flooded in. Yes, there were times I'd clean the homes of families in his school. The shame he must have felt then, even if he never told me. The article apparently implied he'd ridiculed me behind my back to fit in, painting me as an embarrassing footnote. My chest tightened with both hurt and an odd sense of validation. This was the final push, the unmasking of his long-standing contempt. He shook his head, as if trying to dislodge the guilt. I never meant. It's not that I was ashamed. It's just, he trailed off, words lost in the swirl of confusion and panic. The new girlfriend tried to stroke his arm, but he pulled away. He looked at me, fear shining in his eyes. They're calling me a hypocrite now. They're saying I put on this big show of supporting you, but I'm actually ashamed of how we grew up. I took a deep breath, my voice steady when I replied. Are they wrong? The question lingered in the air, almost physically tangible. He opened his mouth to protest, to deny. Then something in his expression broke. He turned away, pressing the back of his hand to his forehead. In that moment, I saw not the arrogant young professional, but the insecure boy who had grown up in a modest home, resentful of the stigma. The tension in my chest eased slightly, replaced by a pang of empathy. At that point, the ex appeared at the end of the corridor, walking toward us with measured steps. The new girlfriend glared at her, blaming her for the fiasco. This was your idea. All of it, she hissed. The ex said nothing at first, just looked at me with a question in her eyes, as though seeking my permission to proceed. I nodded, bracing myself. She then turned to my son. You wanted an image. You wanted a glossy reputation. But you can't plaster over the truth with a few photo ops. That's not how real life works. He glared at her, anger and hurt simmering beneath the surface. You planned this, he accused, voice shaking. She shook her head. I plan to help you see that your reputation isn't just a performance. It's built on how you treat the people who matter, especially those who've supported you. I never meant to ruin you. I wanted to wake you up. He scoffed, turning away, fists clenched. The new girlfriend looked ready to unleash a storm of her own. I could sense the swirl of accusations forming on her lips, but she held back, maybe recognizing that the ex had control of the narrative now. I took a shaky breath. It was all out in the open, the contempt, the insecurities, the manipulated PR stunts. I should have felt triumphant. This was what I'd set in motion, after all. But instead, I felt an overwhelming sadness for the little boy who once cried in my arms, afraid of the dark. I stepped forward, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. No more running. Face it, I told him. He swallowed, his eyes brimming with tears he refused to shed in front of the two women. The new girlfriend hovered, torn between anger and confusion, uncertain if she should remain or flee. He looked at me, his expression helpless. I can't fix this, he said, voice cracking. The stuff they're saying, it's true, I guess. I did feel embarrassed sometimes. I didn't want to be the kid whose mom cleaned houses. And now everyone knows I was a coward about it. I squeezed his shoulder gently. Hiding from it won't make it go away, I said. What matters now is whether you're ready to respect yourself and me enough to admit it openly, not as part of a PR stunt, but because you finally understand that honest work is never shameful. He lowered his head. How do I even start? He asked, sounding younger than I'd heard in years. The ex stepped forward, glancing at me again. I nodded, giving her the floor. You begin by owning up to your mistakes, publicly if need be, she said. You release a statement that doesn't sugarcoat or shift blame. You talk about how you really felt, and you make it clear you're not proud of it, but you're committed to doing better. He snorted bitterly. And that will fix everything? She smiled, but her eyes were sad. It'll be a start. The rest is about your actions from here on out. The new girlfriend stared at both of us, evidently unimpressed. She crossed her arms, shooting my son a withering look. You realize this is going to cost you some of your endorsements or deals, right? She snapped. He didn't respond. He seemed to be lost in an internal storm, wrestling with the knowledge that he couldn't cling to his shallow facade any longer. We stood there for a moment, four people entangled in a web of betrayal, regret, and a strange hope for redemption. The ex slipped her phone into her purse and told him, gently, if you want my help crafting that statement, call me. But only if you're serious. She looked at me one last time before walking away, leaving behind the echo of her footsteps. The new girlfriend, sensing the tension was too thick to cut, followed soon after, murmuring something about how she needed to talk to a friend in PR. That left me alone with him. He let out a ragged breath and turned to face me. His eyes were red. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered. I don't know when I started to believe I was better than you, or that I had to pretend to be someone I'm not. A trembling exhale left my lungs. I put a hand on his cheek, feeling the faint stubble there, a reminder that he was not a child anymore. "It's never too late to find your way back," I said, my voice subdued. We lingered in that quiet hallway, the banquet continuing behind closed doors. The moment felt strangely intimate, a raw confrontation neither of us had wanted, but both of us needed. I thought of the hours I'd spent cleaning so he could have what he needed, the humiliation I felt when he dismissed me as just a cleaner, and the weight of carrying all that pain inside me. Yet now, seeing him on the brink of tears, struggling with genuine remorse, I felt something ease in my heart. Maybe my orchestrated plan had been too harsh, too manipulative. But it forced him to face his own reflection, unmasked. I could only pray that this was the beginning of true understanding and not just another act he'd put on to salvage his image. In the following days, he took tentative steps toward making things right. He wrote a statement, one that took responsibility without excuses, admitting his embarrassment and apologizing to those he'd hurt, especially me. It was released on social media and shared by a few outlets that had covered the rumor. Reactions were mixed. Some appreciated his honesty. Others accused him of damage control. But for once, he didn't seem to care about the clamor. He shut off his notifications and spent more time at home. We talked late into the night, not about glitzy events or big ambitions, but about memories, some painful, some beautiful. He asked me to tell him about the hard days I went through, the nights I'd cry into my pillow because I felt like I was failing him. I was hesitant at first, but once I started talking, it all came spilling out, the years of stress and anxiety, the times I felt small and unworthy because society told me cleaning was menial labor. He listened, his face etched with sorrow. He didn't try to defend himself or dismiss my experiences. He just listened. For the first time in a long while, I felt like he truly saw me. He didn't cut ties with the ex immediately. He wanted to keep her around professionally, at least, seeing as she'd proven her prowess in guiding him through the aftermath. But there was a noticeable shift in how they interacted, now tinged with a deeper, more honest respect. The new girlfriend, on the other hand, bristled at the situation. She couldn't understand why he was suddenly so okay with losing face, or why he felt the need to personally respond to critics. Tension flared between them, culminating in a quiet breakup a few weeks later. He never elaborated on the details, but I sensed it was for the best. She was not the kind of partner who'd stick around when the shimmer of prestige began to dull. In time, I sensed our relationship tentatively healing. He asked for my opinions on matters he used to dismiss. We had dinner without the friction that had lingered before. Of course, the lessons learned didn't vanish overnight. There were moments he'd slip into old habits, showing off or belittling someone unknowingly. But now he caught himself faster, apologized more readily. I found solace in the fact that the seeds of genuine change had been planted. He started volunteering more often, not in grand gestures for the camera, but quietly, without fanfare. Sometimes I went with him, and we'd clean up public parks or run donation drives. The ex and I spoke occasionally, though our conversations were short and polite. She reassured me that he was making strides in therapy, working through the insecurities that fueled his condescending attitude. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was the start of something real. Late one evening, after we finished cleaning up the kitchen together, an act that once would have been unthinkable to him, we sat down at the table. The house was still, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. He reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was wrong. I was cruel and I was ungrateful. You've always been more than just a cleaner. You've been my entire foundation." Tears pricked at my eyes. I squeezed his hand, unable to speak for a moment. Then, with a shaky breath, I told him I forgave him, that I'd always be in his corner, as long as he continued to show sincerity and respect, not just to me, but to himself and everyone else he once deemed beneath him. He nodded, tears glinting in his own eyes. In the quiet that followed, I thought about how this journey had begun with a single careless remark, a remark that cracked the fragile veneer of our relationship and exposed something festering underneath. The path to reconciliation wasn't easy, and perhaps it was a little manipulative, maybe even ethically questionable, to involve his ex in staging a reputational crisis. But sometimes people need a grand, irreversible confrontation with their own reflection to truly see their flaws. I wouldn't say I was proud of the subterfuge, but I was relieved that it led him to a place of vulnerability and introspection. And if, in the process, he finally learned to value honest work, if he learned to see me as a person, not just a role, then maybe it was worth it. The next morning, I woke up early. Instead of rushing to clean or bury myself in chores, I stepped outside onto the porch with a cup of coffee. The sky was painted in the gentle pastel of dawn. I sipped my coffee, letting the steam warm my face, and felt a strange sense of calm. My life hadn't transformed overnight into a perfect portrait. There were still bills to pay, floors to mop, and lingering tensions in my heart. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had my son back. Maybe not the same boy I once knew, but a maturing young man who was learning to break free from the superficial illusions that had trapped him. I listened to the morning birds sing, the distant rumble of a garbage truck making its rounds, and I thought about the nature of cleaning, how it's a cycle, a repetitive act of clearing away dirt and debris, only for new messes to appear. Perhaps that was the real lesson. In life, we're always cleaning up something: our reputations, our relationships, our own hearts. It's never a one-and-done process. But with each cycle, we learn, we grow, and maybe we find a little more respect for those who do the cleaning in all its forms. He joined me on the porch a bit later, eyes still puffy from sleep. He stood beside me, sipping his own coffee in silence. Then, without prompting, he said, "I'm sorry I ever made you feel small." I looked at him, saw the genuineness in his expression, and smiled. "I'm just glad you see me," I replied softly. The sun crept higher in the sky, illuminating the yard. We stood there for a while, mother and son, watchers of a new day. No cameras, no public statements, no show. Just the quiet bonding over a cup of coffee, ready to face another day's mess together. And in that stillness, I felt the gravity of our shared experiences settle into a gentler memory, one that might guide us toward a future built on understanding and mutual respect, rather than the flimsy scaffolding of shallow appearances. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real. And perhaps that was the best kind of clean slate we could hope for.